Solar energy is the cleanest and most abundant renewable energy out there, according to the Solar Energy Industry Association. And in fact, the cost of solar is forecast to decrease 34% by 2030, making renewables more affordable for more people. But affordable doesn't always mean more accessible. Joining me to discuss is Sharina, the founder of Utopia Plastix, a company that provides plant-based alternatives to petroleum-based plastics, and Gilbert Campbell, the founder of Volt Energy, a renewable firm that develops and finances utility scale solar projects. Thank you so much to both of you for joining us. Gilbert, I'll start with you. Are historically marginalized communities being left behind in the transition to clean energy?
Yes, the unequivocal answer would be yes. I've been in the industry since 2008 when I launched my first company, Volt Energy, which distributed generation, so like rooftop solar and solar carports for projects across the country with HBCUs, First African American Church to do solar and stuff like that. I mention that to say, been working in the community for a long time, and there are several barriers as far as, what I've seen as far as residential homeowners, but also, small businesses, nonprofits that are in, underserved, under-resourced communities. Some of it is discriminatory financing, things like looking at credit to be able to provide financing for a homeowner to get solar, when there's been proven that, a credit score is not a good indicator of someone's ability to pay their electric bills. But, so that's been a problem. And we look at environmental injustice to communities that have had the wrong type of power plants as we're now transitioning to a clean energy economy. I think it's only fair that those communities are benefiting from having clean energy, in their backyards. But I will say, I mentioned all kind of the doom and gloom and the reality, but there's a lot of positives that are happening. The Inflation Reduction Act that has Justice 40 and unprecedented amounts of capital that's coming out that will allow for, under-resourced communities to be able to get solar. So the accessibility, that risk will be mitigated substantially by the Inflation Reduction Act. So we're at a really good point in our nation's history where, solar will be there for most of the people that have not had access before.
Is adopting a leasing model part of the solution? Because, I could tell you that I've been looking at putting solar on my roof for the longest time, and the numbers are insane. I mean, what you're talking about in terms of an outlay is tens of thousands of dollars. And I know that there are companies that do something where they put them on and they take care of the maintenance and you just pay them monthly, but you don't even have access to that in some states, right?
That's correct. And so solar leasing is a good strategy for some. It really is a state by state kind of proposition as far as what works best. As an example, I'm based in the Washington, D.C. area, and Washington, D.C. has a very aggressive what's called global portfolio standard, which allows for these things called carbon credits or solar renewable energy credits, which has a monetary value. And by having those things in place, the cost of solar is really low. And the value proposition, you're looking at a return on investment in like 2 to 3 years. So I always tell homeowners that ask me in the Washington, D.C. area, I definitely think if you can, it makes sense for you to own the system because the system lasts 25 to 30 years. But there are other markets where, may be more challenging. And, by having solar, you are able to, produce clean energy going on the grid. But there's some benefits that you can't take advantage of, like tax credits and some of the renewable energy credits and other things when you're in the leasing model. But the leasing model has benefits as well, too. It's almost like homeownership. Homeownership isn't for everyone, but there definitely is some great opportunities for people to be able to own the solar themselves. And again, going back to the Inflation Reduction Act, there are now a lot of mechanisms for homeowners across the country to be able to tap into lower cost of capital, longer durations of capital to spread out, to look at owning the systems as well.
Sharina, we're seeing some issues of equity when it comes to green jobs. It's a huge opportunity, but the workforce remains overwhelmingly white. What is your company doing to make sure that people of color have a seat at the table?
Well, one way that we're doing it starts at the core of who we are. We're a diverse team, mainly made up of minority individuals, women as well, kind of creating and setting a standard for looking at the industry, especially the space of manufacturing, and then also a green technology, being able to publicly put that out there that we're intentionally doing something different. But we also see this space of equity because farming is at the very root of what we do. It's by building models that intentionally create equity. And we look at equity and the amount of farmers able to participate in our program really based on demographics. So you're looking at a demographic. If the demographic is 8% or 10% African American in that community, we want 8 to 10% African Americans to have an opportunity to participate. That's how we see equity and opportunity in this space. But we also view it as when we move into the manufacturing space, we look at manufacturers and strategic partners. What do your diversity and inclusion initiatives look like? Are you focused and are you a good partner for us? Because at the core, that's what sustainability is. It's not only about a green product or a green technology. It's about how are we positively impacting our society as well as creating economic opportunity. So we create an economic opportunity as well as making sure that we are making a positive impact on our society as well as our environment.
No, I've been working on climate issues for a long time, and I've noticed that there's this incredible intersection between climate and environmental justice. One of them that I think about is the fact that urban areas are hotter because there's more concrete and more asphalt and more emissions. But also, a lot of urban residential areas tend to have far fewer trees. And I wonder if either of you could just speak to this intersection between environmental justice and climate.
I will say that that's a real issue, but I think it goes back to the core of how some of these urban areas became habitually underutilized business zones as well. So then the incentives for manufacturing and corporations to bring in operations and take up a lot of that green space with different types of developments that reduce the amount of spaces that people would come into collectively to enjoy that. And then we often see those green places placed around the urban communities, but not in the urban communities. So again, there becomes intentionality when you're seeking development in there. And it could even be from the space of, if you're going to incentivize to come into urban communities, what are you also doing to bring that element of a green space along with you?
Yeah, and just to add to piggybacking on Sharina's point, to your point, Carl, as well, the intersectionality of climate and environmental justice. You mentioned the urban heat island effect, but just unpack that for a second. You know, there's certain parts that I use Washington D.C. Certain districts in Washington D.C. In the summertime they can be 20 degrees hotter. So if you think about it, let's say it's 80 degrees in one area, it's 100 degrees. Think about the impact to that homeowner. You know, you're talking about spending more for electricity where you're already burdened. So you're talking about energy burden. But now you're looking at things like higher rates of asthma and things that are already exacerbated. And then, you know, a lot of those, you know, areas that have urban heat island effects, a lot of times you also have food deserts. You don't have access to, you know, grocery stores and being able to get clean food. So as climate disasters continue to get worse and worse, those communities are hit even harder. And so I think it's important that we mitigate, you know, a lot of these issues, but also from a resiliency perspective, make sure we prioritize those communities. So when these disasters hit, you know, we have a place for them to go, but we're thinking around the corner as well, too.
I know that you both work with big corporations. Should large companies take a bigger role in making sure that everyone is benefiting?
Absolutely. Whether you're small, medium, or large company, we're all part of a community. We're all part of the country. And we're all part of a global world. And so we have a responsibility as businesses to make sure we're good stewards. And part of that is good environmental stewards. And so as we're, you know, using, you know, energy to deliver the goods and services that we need in order to run our businesses, we have to make sure that we aren't picking winners and losers as far as communities that are suffering in order for us to deliver goods and services. So absolutely.
I think the other part is too, many of these corporations, their consumers are in those communities. A lot of those are in those underserved or underrepresented communities. So you can't ignore that. And I would say, let's take us back to COVID, the industry and what happened, how many of those individuals in the service industry contributed to our own services, our own survival, our own needs, how much they delivered there. And corporations benefited from that. Corporations cannot ignore what's happening in these urban communities, and the health outcomes, as Gilbert mentioned, are a key part of it, as well as our education and the creation of jobs and opportunities. And so even looking at as STEM programs are developed, to not exclude these communities as well as part of the incentives that go in to educate. And we also look at the number of employers that often are present in corporations in urban communities, but the percentage of residents in those communities that are actually employed by those corporations is a factor there. So there has to be a lot of intentionality to change the narrative.
You mentioned STEM programs, and I often think of climate as being a children's issue because younger people will be affected so much more by climate change. And so, how important is it for youth to be involved in these issues, in both environmental justice and climate?
I look at today, a lot of what we see in climate activism is through that Gen Z, especially now. And our youth, they are excited. They have an invested interest. I have 17-year-old boys. I have students from middle schools to elementary that reach out. I'm part of a STEM program here in Oklahoma City as focused on educating and creating opportunity for STEM learning through our schools. Interesting enough, when STEM programs like that are created to involve youth, it does also engage their parents and it gives them an opportunity to be educated as well. So it really is a good community approach as well as an effective approach to reach those young people, get them excited about it now, help them understand the economic opportunities, because that's another thing that oftentimes in these communities, most of what the thought is to create opportunity is through entertainment. But now you're bringing in science, technology, engineering, and math, and get them excited about what that looks like. Make sure that representation is seen as well, that you intentionally, if you are in a STEM field, make sure that you're making yourself known to the communities and making yourself available to those school programs as well.
I agree with everything Sharina said, and I would just briefly add, youth are vital. There's no greater investment that we can make other than young people, and it also energizes us because, like Sharina, I have the opportunity going across the country talking to whether it be elementary school students, middle school students, high school students, college students, and when you talk to them, they understand the importance of climate change. They also understand technology, and we're talking about tech. This is clean technology. And so when you look at what are the areas that they're attracted to, it's a great opportunity. Sharina mentioned really the concept of backpack marketing where, let's make it normal for students to go to school in an energy efficient building, with solar panels, energy storage. So when they go home, they can share what they've learned. I think it's critically important that we have to invest in young people. But also, we look at our generations and other generations that have come before them. We haven't left the planet in a good place for them. And we have to recognize that and reverse some of these trends. But I will say, from a global perspective, I think we're at a great point where we're going through the decarbonization of our electric sector, the decarbonization of our transportation sector with things like electric vehicles, and the electrification of our buildings with things like, smart thermostats and heat pumps and things like that. So as we're moving towards that, who are going to be the young geniuses that are going to create the next wave of, innovative companies who are going to be taking on these jobs of the future? It's the younger generation, and we have to make sure that they're prepared, they're privy to these opportunities, and it's across the board. It's not just in, affluent school districts, but rural America and inner city communities that have been on the front line of bad environmental policies and, citing issues and environmental health challenges are at the forefront too, making sure those kids are getting an equal shot as well too.
I would like to add to that briefly, Carl, about even what we've seen in some of these programs, that there's kind of a behavior that has to be removed a little bit. And it's feeling like there has to be all these studies within an urban community to determine if a STEM program is valuable or will be needed. Those aren't the same permissions asked in other more affluent communities. In fact, if it's
Yeah,
seen to be of economic benefit, a program is placed or offered. That we have to remove that element. It's kind of like asking somebody that you know is starving whether they need food. When we know that it's a need in the community, that we have to be willing to supply it.
absolutely. Absolutely. I wanted to ask because there's so much in this arena that, in both the climate justice arena and just climate change in general, that is distressing and daunting. So, what I'm wondering is what gives you hope? What, makes you feel as if though, maybe, we could turn this thing around? Do you have any thoughts about that? This is to both of you.
I tell people every day I get to wake up and know that I'm in the business of doing good.
Hmm.
And for us, in where we see change, there's no greater time for innovators and people that want to see something change. Now we're in the brink of one of the most searched words is sustainability. And so to be able to create a solution, I have a lot of hope for diverse groups of people for the future. I also have a lot of hope because I've seen how our young people have responded. I've seen kind of a new horizon. We're in the horizon of many great things and opportunity. And so I keep my eyesight there and the focus on what positive change looks like. But and understanding it may be a little bit daunting. There's going to be work, there's going to be education to it, but I've watched in a few years how the work that we're doing has taken hold across the globe. And so that gets us excited and me excited as well. And so I have a lot of hope for what the future looks like.
And Sharina, I share that same hope and optimism as well. I mean, it's difficult when you put on the news and there's the political divide in this country, but I think the great equalizer, and I'm a optimist at heart. I guess you have to be as an entrepreneur. But if we look at some of the things I mentioned before, like the decarbonization of our power sector, we're going to have more renewables to be able to combat climate change. And it can't come from the same areas. And so, there's great stories that I can share, where we look at, as an example, frontline folks that have worked on coal power plants that are now being displaced. Those coal miners that have risked their lives for decades and decades to make sure we've had power in this country. Some have dealt with like black lung disease. As we're moving towards clean energy, they should be prioritized. And that is happening.
Yeah.
And when you look at the Inflation Reduction Act, there's energy communities. So developers like ourselves are incentivized to build in rural communities where you have displacing of fossil fuel plants. Conversely, in urban communities where, the wrong type of power plants have been placed in those communities, highways run through those. So as we're talking about, again, decarbonization of the power sector, there's additional tax credits and incentives to build in those communities as well from a power perspective. But you also look at electric vehicle charging station. It's going to have to be built in rural areas and inner cities. And so when you look at inner cities particularly, the biggest source of carbon emissions is transportation. So now when we're looking at making that transition, that's a great opportunity, to right some wrongs, and I have hope for that. And so I'll just give one example. Our company works with some very large companies, some of the largest companies in the world, on developing utility scale solar, but we created some innovation. Came up with this concept called the Environmental Justice Power Purchase Agreement. A power purchase agreement, or PPA, is just how corporations buy clean energy. But we wanted to transform that, because if you just look at how clean energy is developed, it's in large rural areas, because you're not going to find 300 acres in Washington, D.C., Baltimore, Detroit, et cetera, et cetera. So our corporate partners contribute a portion through the PPA into a foundation we started called Sharing the Power Foundation. We contribute a portion of our revenue. The foundation intentionally is making investments in both rural communities across this country and undersourced minority communities, and it's bridging the gap of people not being able to talk to each other. So a specific example, through the foundation, we have a program where we invest in college students from historically Black colleges and universities. We had a young lady that a student at Howard University that worked with a nonprofit in Appalachia that was helping homeowners and businesses throughout Appalachia transition over to solar. And she shared with me her experience of talking to people that don't look like her. And conversely, they had the same experience with her, being able to think about how can they solve some of our biggest problems, brought them together. And you have a Black-run company, a Black-run foundation that has invested in organizations like the Center for Coalfield Justice. We made an investment in that's training displaced coal miners to come into clean energy jobs, be part of the just transition. So the more that we can break down a lot of these barriers, so we're not living in a society where we're all talking past each other and we're moving towards common goals. Climate change is only accelerating, and it costs everyone we don't do it when there's inaction. And so, I think these are one of the areas where let's remove the political noise and let's build bridges and rebuild our nation's infrastructure through clean energy. And so that definitely keeps me optimistic and hopeful.
Yeah, Sharina, at the heart of so many of these issues, whether it's climate change or environmental justice, pollution in general, it's equity. It's all about equity. It's about one group taking advantage of another group, primarily for profit. And how do you think we can get away from that model? What can we do to move into a new direction?
What we can't do is view it as one entity's problem. We can't, right now, we're in, as Gilbert mentioned, we're in a political divide. And that political divide is divisive. We can't look at it as government as being the only source for solving it, because at the same time, so much of that is going to be run by big business. So the requirement is going to have to be for us to understand it's those that really have a desire to see change are going to have to do more than just talk about what change will look like. They have to be an active part in creating models, as Gilbert took the opportunity with his organization to see a problem, develop a model, develop a foundation that is actually proven outcomes. So that's another part of what we have to do, is be able to view it as we see the problem. What solution are we going to create? Not for somebody else to create, but what solution might we create? And then are we going to focus on measurable outcomes to actually see that and be honest with ourselves when those outcomes need to be shifted, pivoted, changed, whatever it may have to be be able to get the desired results. And I think even today, not long ago, I was a part of a summit that was held in Las Vegas. And it was really in focusing on the UN and the SDG goals and initiatives. But what it really focused on is how family offices even get involved in creating a part of the change rather than relying on government to do it. When we know that there are financial resources to do something different, when we know that there's innovation and technology able to do something different, and we know that there are groups of people, policy and change can come after that. But you know what's being delivered in the process? Results, because there were intentional efforts to create the change. And I think we really have to rethink. We really have to rethink what we've done. We really have to rethink how we've gotten here and be intentional about how we change that narrative.
Yeah, introspection seems to be a very important part of this process. I thank you both very much, Sharina Perry, Gilbert Campbell, for a wonderful conversation, and hopefully we'll continue to move in the right direction. We've got a lot of work to do. Thank you so much. For more conversations like these, you can like and subscribe to Pattrn.